Psychologists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Part 2. Not a psych, but I worked with parolees for a while as my first job. There was one guy that still sends shivers up my spine whenever I think about him. He came in straight from court and sometimes we didn't receive the details of the offenses before we met with them. This was one of those times. I called him into the office and started going through his paperwork, rules and restrictions of his order, how often he had to report, etc. He started requesting a male officer and stated that he hated females and got along better with men because they understood him. At this point, I still didn't know what he had done to be on parole and he did not want to disclose anything. He spent about 30 minutes talking about how he was the victim of the crime and that females had it out for him. He was very hostile and kept looking at me with a disgusted look and sat with his arms crossed. The paperwork finally came through about an hour into the meeting. He was on for some very serious and disgusting offenses against females. I then let him know that I had received the paperwork and asked him to discuss what had happened. We were asked to get their version of events. It was like something switched and he suddenly became very happy and almost proud of what he had done. He kept standing up and acting out what he had done in detail while smiling the whole time and asking me what I thought of it all. Without going into detail about his offenses, it was very graphic and hard to hear, and the fact that he appeared to be so proud of it was just chilling. He also kept asking whether I thought he was the victim of the crime and at one point asked me if I had any contact numbers for victim compensation for himself. Towards the end of the meeting, he was trying to charm me and kept asking me what time I was finishing work and whether I was parked nearby. I left with a group of my colleagues that day. He ended up back in jail about a month later, and while I am all for rehabilitation of offenders, I sincerely hope he stays in there. Not a psychologist, but I used to have to escort jail inmates to sessions, and sit in for them. They manipulate the living shit out of healthcare workers, and I was legally not permitted to say a word about it during sessions. They'd scam for meds, try to get all sorts of legal favors, lie their asses off, and generally treated it like a vacation or field trip. In one instance, a guy who had been previously convicted for rape of a minor under 2, and who had also done prison time for stealing urns from a cemetery, dumping the ashes out in a dumpster, and selling them for scrap metal, had this shrink tearing up with his fake life story and agreeing to prescribe him a ton of different meds he really didn't need and write a strongly worded letter to the district attorney in his favor. After the shrink did so, it ended up not mattering because he was given an additional charge for brutally raping another inmate, who was wheelchair-bound. I recall the shrink, almost distraught, remarking to me that she couldn't believe such a nice guy would ever do that. I just responded that the guys I bring her aren't in full restraints on accident and that I am lethally armed and armored during such escorts to protect her from them more than anything. I think that mental health care staff are good-natured and want to help, but naive as shit and are routinely scammed by scumbags. I also think that they tend to be a bit pompous and it gives them blind spots, like a sort of "I'm too smart to ever be taken for a ride by my patients" mentality. Overall, I think they do a lot of good, but I think that they need to realize some of their patients more than deserve everything that's happening to them and are not worth talking to at all. Not a psychologist, but I used to work in a psych ward as security. We had this huge guy with schizophrenia detained in ones, which is the ward for those who have been legally determined to be unfit and are not allowed to leave. When I say huge, I mean he was like 6 feet 5 inches, gigantic muscles, and he used to be an MMA fighter. Real nice guy when medicated, but when in psychosis, he was not someone you'd want to go toe-to-toe with. We would sometimes have to call police to help us deal with him. One officer would arrive, take a look at him and go nope and call for backup. So one day I was guarding the entrance to ones. He was doing fairly okay, so he wasn't confined to his room and was allowed to walk around the supervised communal space. He puts down his magazine, goes into his room and then walks out naked. Dude walks up to me, stands about an inch away and looks down at me. I mean way down, as I'm only 5 feet 3 inches. He tells me he's leaving. I asked if he would like some shoes or a gown. He says no, he's leaving and I better step aside. So I did. You better believe I stepped the fuck aside and let him walk out. I followed him at a safe distance through the psych ward, where everyone basically pinned themselves against the wall to get away, and out into the parking lot while on the call with the cops. I can't leave the grounds, so once he was off hospital property, I could only inform the police to which way he was running, which was down into a heavily populated downtown core. Not even 15 minutes later, he comes back and walks back into the lobby of the ward and asks for me. He wants shoes after all. Not a robe, but shoes. So I bring him shoes to prevent him from getting violent, and off he goes again as I repeat the process, following him to the edge of the grounds and calling the cops. Cops bring him back and put him into a secure room. However, once he is in there, they are not allowed to restrain past a certain point. So the whole security team assembles, which is me and about 5 men. They decide I'm to hold a leg as I'm small and legs are easier to restrain. So we go into the room in a triangle formation with me as the last to enter. He must have missed when I came in the door, because he started screaming that I was a shapeshifter and freaking out. It took us about 30 minutes of restraining him before he was medicated enough to calm down. Fast forward maybe 2 years later. I'm no longer security or live in the town, but I went for a metal show. I joked to friends that I was worried someone I had dealt with in the hospital might recognize me and have bad memories. Lo and behold, there's MMA fighter taking shots at the bar. Now I know that he shouldn't be drinking with his meds, but hey, it's been 2 years and I don't know anything about his current health status, so whatever. I still tried to avoid him in case he remembered my shape-shifting. At one point our lines to the bar coincided, and I ended up standing next to him. He looked up at me, looked down and then looked back up and stared hard. I could tell he recognized me, but I could also tell that he was trying to figure out from where. The entire night I could see him lingering around me, staring with this befuddled expression on his face. I was a tad scared. Therapist in training and my tutor, who is a childhood abuse and trauma specialist, tells some horror stories. The one that stood out for this question was a guy in his mid-40s who had lived most of his life with extreme paranoia that his parents were sending people to get information from him to blackmail him with. This guy was extremely unstable and was legally obligated to go to therapy after committing some petty theft because he believed his parents were tracking his money. Anyway, he'd been going for about 6 weeks and he began to talk about a plan for the future. He was kind of vague but said he had worked out a way to break free from his childhood and move forward. My tutor was apprehensive but hopeful. He had been making good progress in the previous sessions. Fast forward a week and this guy is back again. He's noticeably agitated and carrying a large sports bag. My tutor remarks that she's pleased to see him and likes his new bag. He breaks down. He confesses that he has a machete in the bag and had planned to kill everyone from his old life, starting with his therapist, so he could be free from his past, but she was very nice and would be hard to kill. My tutor politely excused herself and called the police. The guy was very compliant. He'd pretty much given up at that point, but the police confirmed he did indeed have a large machete in his bag and his car was full of bin bags. She said that was the only time she felt she was close to dying and says the moral of the story is to treat all your clients well because you never know who's plotting your murder. Worked in a mental health facility for children for 6 months. Saddest 6 months of my life. Top 3 shocking things that happened were: severely schizophrenic 16-year-old teenage boy who was around 5 feet tall, 90 pounds, would get put into a straitjacket during one of his episodes, and he could physically take down the 6'3" 230 pounds male tech, while being in a straitjacket. He would speak in voices that almost sounded demonic while doing it. It was horrifying. Severely schizophrenic 17-year-old girl would hide in a corner, wait till her targeted worker would walk by, stick her hands down the front of her pants into her vagina, grab a handful of period blood, and smack us across the face with the blood. She did this to me more than once and I had to go to the hospital more than once, during work hours, to get tested, especially when the blood would get close to our mouths and eyes. Very sweet, but very non-verbal 13-year-old boy would masturbate, constantly. Constantly. Pants down, penis out, masturbating, all day, all night, in front of everyone and anyone. He had elephantiasis of his penis and part of one of his legs, so these events were not only disturbing and inappropriate, there was literally a practical problem with him taking his 1.5-foot-long penis out of his pants. It seriously took 2 people to pack it back in, and then he would drop his pants and take it out all over again. Not a psychologist, but my brother is. I will not for the life of me tell anyone this guy's name, and my brother told me about it because it kind of messed him up. My brother started his practice, ran from his house, in the same city where I went to college. He worked with this guy who was in my class. We were both econ majors, and I saw him around all the time. He seemed pretty white bread. Wore tees and jeans all the time, headphones in, quiet. Only thing that was weird was he carried a laptop bag/briefcase in addition to his backpack. He started seeing my brother about 2 months into freshman year. He came in for depression, and went through some basic stuff. He didn't feel like he fit in, he didn't know how to talk to people. My brother said this all felt very rehearsed to him. Like, he seemed to be rattling it off from memory. After a few sessions, things changed. The guy says he sees things. He said he can't stand being alone in dark rooms. His roommate moved out of his dorm, so it made it worse. He said he sees things move when he's in the dark. Small, almost imperceptible movements in the corner of his eye. He says he is scared all the time at night. This worried my brother, because before then, it was just depression. Paranoia wasn't a good sign, and he started to think this guy was schizophrenic. The movements apparently got worse. Around late November, this guy started calling my brother's work phone, which happened to be a cell that my brother kept on him, at night. 2 a.m., almost like clockwork, this guy would call. Because my brother was afraid this guy's state might deteriorate, he answered the first ones. He said it was awful. His voice was strained, this guy was barely whispering into the phone, he could hear the guy crying. It went on like this for days. Eventually it got to the point where my brother, at their next in-person meeting, told him he needed to take off second semester and seriously consider inpatient care, and that he needed to focus on other patients. He referred him to a health center, and another psychologist who was more experienced with serious cases. This guy cried in his office after being told that. He cried and apologized for over an hour, and he just kept saying, "I'm so fucking scared." I never saw this guy after holiday break. My brother has a few more meetings with him, and he agreed to an inpatient care center after a talk with his parents. 4 months later. It is April, my brother starts seeing lights outside his window at weird times. Not car lights, but like, flashlights. He figured it was just drunk college kids being insensitive. One night he hears knocking on his door, like quick slams, but he ignores it. That same night he gets a call, and he has since changed his policy for late night calls, and he ignores it. It's the guy. He is screaming into the phone. "They're back. They're back. They're back." And he says it faster and faster until he starts crying on speaker, and he says on the message, "I'm outside, please let me in, please." Before the message ends you can hear him slamming on my brother's front door. The guy didn't talk to my brother after that. He committed suicide 3 months later, we found out. Obligatory, not a psychologist. I was a patient in an inpatient/outpatient program for adolescents and children, so in the building there were kids aged 5 to 18. For the most part, the older kids and younger kids didn't interact, only saw each other in passing or if they had earned free time, like recess but inside. I earned a lot of free time and happened to befriend one of the younger girls, maybe 6 years old and looked exactly like Dora the Explorer. She was so small and so sweet, and really liked me, so I never saw her upset. One day we were coloring together with colored pencils in a quiet area, and her psychiatrist came in to check on her. Apparently little Dora did not like said psychiatrist, because the doctor sat down with us and Dora instantly went silent. We continued coloring as the doctor was asking questions, and suddenly Dora began to rage shake. She went quiet, clenched her teeth, turned a nice bright shade of red, and proceeded to stab the psychiatrist in the hand with her colored pencil. She stabbed with such gusto that it went all the way through this poor woman's hand. You could clearly see it coming out of the other end. It did not help that I was already there for trauma, but it was truly a terrifying experience. I still don't quite trust kids to this day because you never know what their little bodies are capable of doing. Not a psychologist, but mine told me something kind of fucked. 2 years ago I was seeing her and she helped me to see that my boyfriend was very abusive and I credit her with being able to escape that relationship. I didn't see her for a long time after that but got back in touch with her a couple months ago. After a few sessions she said she wanted to tell me something that she absolutely shouldn't tell me, so I was obviously intrigued. Apparently a few weeks after our last session 2 years ago, a man made a first-time appointment. He walked in and immediately gave her the creeps. She said he stood too close and towered over her. He was clearly trying to be charming but had the pungent vibe of a true narcissist. As they talked, he was condescending and smug. He started talking about how his relationship had ended because his ex was crazy and unrealistic, but that he would take her back if she started acting right. As he gave more details about his ex, her stomach dropped because she realized he was talking about me. Knowing all the shit he did to me and recognizing his narcissistic personality, she was freaked. She said he was clearly trying to discredit me to my own therapist so that I might be cut off from my main support. She said that isn't uncommon, but she's never felt so completely chilled by someone's presence before. She sought advice from her supervisor and was going to call him out at their next appointment and tell him she wouldn't see him anymore, but he didn't show and never contacted her again. That guy put me through hell, and it was honestly so validating that my psychologist got to see his shit personality for herself. I'm a psychologist, but I'm a SPED teacher. I used to work in a self-contained room for behavioral disorders, high school. I have several, but I feel like I wouldn't want to share the actual emotional ones out of respect for those students. Behaviorally, though. Wowza. One of the craziest ones was the young man that I knew was a psychopath. His father was in jail for molesting the younger sister. He lived with his mother. She was a really nice lady and cared a great deal about how he did in school. Right before the father was to be released from jail, he tried to convince the kid to burn down the house in an attempt to kill the mom. He did try. He did manage to destroy their home, but he failed to kill the mom and he ran away. I was able to tip off the police as to where he ran off to. A couple of months later, when the father was released from prison, he showed up to where the mom was staying and stabbed the mom to death, and back to prison he went. I had no idea what happened to the kid for years, but would look him up on the inmate search from time to time, until one day I had a hit. He was in jail for raping a young girl and was in jail as well. He has since been rehabilitated and released and is now living out in the world amongst us. I have no idea where. Edit it to fix some grammar. I'm a psychiatrist. I used to work in a psychiatric ward, and the nurses called me because of a visitor who was making a fuss in the communal area. It was the boyfriend of a 16-year-old schizophrenic girl. He was making a speech about how we were keeping the patients in a prison, brainwashing them, part of the system, and why not. I asked him to leave as he was distressing the patients. He started to get violent, called me a bitch and etc. Now, it's important to tell you that we don't have security in the hospital. It's a Catholic hospital and the nuns are against it, don't know why. If the patients get aggressive, we deal with talking or medication. But, he was not a patient. And, mind you, I'm not a big girl. I'm 160 meters and weight 52 kilograms. Anyway, the girl started to yell, asking the boyfriend to take her out of there, saying she was in great danger. The boyfriend told her he would do anything for her, anything to save her. A Romeo and Juliet scene. Very dramatic. And I was like, sir, I'll have to ask you to leave. When he tried to beat me, another patient came to help me, a big guy. He finally left with the maintenance guy escorting him and yelling at me, I'm going to kill you. I'm going after you and kill you. I went home that week looking one side to the other. When the girl got better, she broke up with him. She said he was nuts.